AI changes the payoff functions of different types of human activities. Learning, I think, over production, relationship over things, and then capital over labor.
Priest, prostitute, politician. There might be a demand specifically that the service be provided by a human being as opposed to a machine.
You think you want this fundamental novelty, deep purpose, this world historic sense of meaning. What you actually want is a lot of pleasure, social engagements, aesthetic experiences.
We are seemingly approaching this critical juncture in human history upon which the next billion years might depend. This, if you want real purpose, knock yourself out now, because it's never gonna be more at stake than it is right now and in the next few years.
What was striking to me was how theological our entire conversation today has been, and how similar to the Christian afterlife.
Once you have a superintelligence explosion, you sort of zip fast forward to technological maturity. Human capital is a depreciating asset in this world of advancing AI.
When I used GPT-3 for the first time, it filled me first with awe and then with dread, because I could see how close AI was in surpassing me in research, writing, philosophy that I trained so hard for. If the Copernican revolution took away our special place in the universe, and Darwin robbed us of our special place in nature, then AI threatens to undermine the last pride of the human race, our intelligence. Today, work gives many of us purpose and meaning, but AI is making more and more of that work obsolete, until one day, perhaps all human activity may be redundant. Nick Bostrom's Deep Utopia is about that day and what to do about it. In this interview, you're going to learn where you can invest your time, effort, and resources that is most AI-proof, and what the good life looks like in a world where AI has made you obsolete. My name is Jonathan B. I'm a fellow at the Cosmos Institute researching philosophy and artificial intelligence. If you want to make sense of this new age of AI we're entering, please subscribe. Without further ado, Nick Bostrom. AI changes the payoff functions of different types of human activities. Certain activities are going to be made obsolete a lot sooner, and other activities seem to be a lot more robust. And so the three I want to talk with you about are learning, I think, over production, relationship over things, and then capital over labor. So by the first one, learning over production, what I was thinking about was, in your book, you gave this thought experiment of a technology that can help us learn. And you described this as potentially one of the most difficult technologies to create, because it requires of you potentially reading and then changing billions, if not trillions, of synapses in our brains, right? To be able to learn a new language or gain the experience of becoming a good father or a good mother. And so my thought is, anyone engaged in intellectual work, your production may be rendered obsolete. Maybe in just a few years' time, we can feed in, your book, Deep Utopia. A podcast, an interview AI will generate a better script than the one that we can have today. And then video AI is able to create something a lot more beautiful than the conversation we're having. However, if I wanted to...
beautiful.
Yes, even more beautiful. However, if I wanted to understand Professor Bostrom's work, I still have to do the hard work of sitting there and reading it, it seems, for a much longer time. So that seems to be one area of life that's going to be a lot more resistant to AI innovation.
Yeah, if you think about what it actually would require through some sort of neurotechnology to sort of directly download skills. So first you would have to have the ability to read off what your current synapses, how they are configured, right? And as you said, millions or billions or trillions of them. Then you would need to interpret what all of those synapses actually encode, like currently, and then figure out how they would need to be changed in such a way that they now encode this additional knowledge that you want to download, without sort of messing up what's already there or changing your personality too much. And then you would have to physically change all of these. So this definitely seems like a task for mature superintelligence. But until that time, if you do want to have some sort of relatively fine-grained control over what goes on inside your brain, for now, the best method is the traditional one of reading and thinking and talking and working on yourself and meditating, etc.
I think that's actually quite optimistic, because it means, at least according to Aristotle, in the beginning of his Metaphysics, he says, all men desire to know, that knowledge and the contemplative life is in some sense the most human life for Aristotle, that is the one that will be made obsolete at the end.
Yeah, I always find it a little bit funny when philosophers are like thinking what's the best and highest form of being a human, and the conclusion is being a philosopher. But maybe they are right. Well, I've actually for a long time thought of philosophy as something that has a deadline. In fact, this I think occurred to me in my late teens. It seemed to me that at some point our current philosophical efforts would be rendered obsolete either by AIs that could, become super intelligent, or maybe by humans developing cognitive enhancements of various forms that would make subsequent generations much better at this. And so that rather than spending my time thinking about the sort of eternal questions of philosophy, it seemed more useful to focus on that subset of the questions in philosophy where it might actually matter whether we get the answer now as opposed to in a few hundred years.
Would you prefer to know the answers to those eternal questions?
Well, one is certainly curious, but if we do end up in a trajectory where human lifespan becomes extremely long, then maybe rather than sort of using up all these mysteries right away to immediately know the answers, maybe you would want to spread it out a little bit so that you have sort of interesting things to learn and discover even hundreds of years, thousands of years into the future. Ignorance might become a scarce commodity. Maybe put some in the shelf for like the bottle of champagne, that's from a specific year that there are only small numbers of left. You might want to save it for a special occasion. But yeah, there might be some other, professions as well that are sort of relatively immune or variables that where it's not just the specific knowledge and skills we have, but the fact that these things be done by a human is regarded as significant in its own right.
Right. Could you give some examples?
Well, I mean, I did a priest, prostitute, politician, where there might be a demand specifically that the service be provided by a human being as opposed to a machine, even if the machine could have all the same functional attributes.
I want to move on to the second type of human activity that is somewhat AI resistant. And that seems to be relationships over things. And what I mean by that is, in your book, you gave a thought experiment of, let's say we're at technological maturity, and we have a better version of an AI parent in every domain, right? So it's better at changing diapers, it's better at teaching, it's better at emotional support. I still would be willing to bet that most people wouldn't want to completely outsource their role as a parent. This could be even more resistant to even technologically mature AI, because what's constitutive to forming a relationship is that it requires, at least in our current view, two humans.
Yeah, I think relationships is one of the more plausible places where we might find purpose that survives this transition to technological maturity. There is some value in honoring and continuing this existing relationship between two people. And that even if you could sort of teleport in a robotic surrogate that would be sort of functionally superior, it wouldn't be as good. Or maybe it would be better in some respects, but it would also lose this value of sort of continuing the current relationship. Even if the robot sort of appeared indistinguishable from the original parent, if you imagine a thought experiment where nobody would actually notice any difference, you might still think that the reality is that there is now this different person who is playing the parenting role. And if you care about sort of truth in relationships, that might already be a disvalue. And so, yeah, the existing human relationships, to the extent that they sort of partially consist of sort of intrinsically valuing this connection to a particular other being, would potentially be resistant.
What are things in a child's education that are potentially made more obsolete given the current wave of innovation in AI?
Well, potentially all of it, but we don't know how long that will take, right? So it makes sense to hedge your bets a bit. You don't want to find yourself 18 or 20 going on the labor market with no skills, and it turns out the whole AI transition has been delayed. So yeah, I would want to make sure to hedge your bets, get the broad basis of useful stuff, but then also have fun while it lasts. I think it would also be a shame to have wasted your childhood.
Perhaps we are too trigger happy in declaring that certain things are made obsolete given technology. And for example, so I went through the Chinese education system, and it had perhaps the oddity when compared to the Western education system, an extreme emphasis on math, like rapid arithmetic computation, including memorization of the classics. And I think it's tempting to think that, even with the printing press, memorization is no longer needed. We have access to all these great books, but certainly with the internet and with calculators in our pockets, that we don't need to know these things. Even though machines can perform it better, there's a lot of alpha, I think, to be had in perfecting these skills, because it's not just that it cultivates your character, it enables you to see things that other people might not.
I would also say general judgment, and especially in these kind of turbulent times with all social media, so many mimetic dynamics that people are now exposed. So having a kind of robust, cognitive immune system where you can sort of reflect yourself on what makes sense and what doesn't, and not getting swept up in whatever latest fad or cult or memes that are sort of bombarding you. I think that certainly is something I would also want to see.
I want to explore the third and last potential activity that would be more resistant. Again, this is not in technological maturity, but just on the way there. And that's capital over labor. Because one anecdote you brought up is how shocks to the labor market throughout history have changed whether the disproportion of production going to capital or labor has shifted. And so, for example, post-Black Plague, one of the best times to be a peasant in human history, because so much of the labor force was called that they had a lot more bargaining or negotiating power. And so I think you hear these stories of them having holidays for half the year or something like that, because they had so much more bargaining and negotiating power. It seems like AI, again, on the way there, will do the reverse, right? It'll make labor extremely abundant. And so practically, if I'm someone in law school or someone in medical school, training 10, 20 years before I can start making capital, and I'm building up my labor, I'm building up a skill, that trade-off suddenly seems a lot less attractive.
Yes, human capital is a depreciating asset in this world of advancing AI. And so investments with very long payback times, especially if you're doing them only because of the ultimate payoff of a higher salary 20 years into the future or something, should be discounted, accordingly. I mean, you would have to have scenarios where AI development takes longer, or where it gets so regulated that they can't perform these particular jobs.
Let me read you a quote from your book. Keynes predicted that by 2030, accumulated savings and technical progress would increase productivity relative to his own time between 4-fold and 8-fold, and as a consequence, the average working week would decrease to 15 hours. As we approach 2030, the first part of Keynes' prediction is on track to vindication. The second part of Keynes' prediction, on the other hand, would appear to be about to miss its mark. If trends are extrapolated, while it is true that working hours have declined substantially, we are nowhere near the 15-hour work week that Keynes expected. Why do you think this is?
Greed has triumphed over sloth. I think the reason is twofold. First, status competition. So we work hard to afford a whole bunch of things, going well beyond our basic material needs. So we don't just want a car, we want a car that's nicer than the cars everybody else has, etc. And so that provides potentially unlimited demand, right, for more, because the bar keeps raising. And then I think the other factor, I think, is a kind of work ethics that is a fairly ingrained norm that it's sort of virtuous to be not just loafing on the sofa, but to sort of exert yourself.
It's interesting because most people think that we've yet to approach this sort of post-scarcity world where all of our fundamental needs can just be met like that. But at least in the first world, North America, Western Europe, that seems to be far gone. Like most people are able to sustain themselves just fine. And so it seems like maybe it's less so greed that has triumphed over sloth, but vanity. Because now the reason that people work, I do think it's mostly this kind of social drive. Rousseau, I think, talks about this in his second discourse, where he kind of flips the view of the direction of scarcity. So in Rousseau's second discourse, in his state of nature, before civilization is formed, there's actually a state of natural abundance. Not because the productive capacities are actually increased, but because people don't have these social vain in Rousseau's perspective, vain desires that civilization has cultivated. But it's actually in civilization that scarcity increases. Again, not because of the amount of things that have diminished, but the amount of new desires that have been born.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a form of scarcity that has been quite pervasive through human history and prehistory, even aside from civilization, in that there were many things that were really needed in some sense, but not available to most people or indeed any people. Say, like quality healthcare. If you were a hunter-gatherer and you got sick, maybe you could rub some leaf, but there are a lot of conditions that couldn't be fixed that way. And occasionally there would be periods of famine as well. Maybe you get the cold season or something else. And so I think it's kind of, to some extent, been endemic up until a couple of 100 years ago, and in many parts of the world until more recently, or still today. We've been in a sort of approximately Malthusian condition. So yes, there has been various advances in productivity and all kinds of technologies, over thousands of years, but whenever the economy grew by 10%, the human population also grew by 10%, and the average income still hovered around subsistence, with some fluctuations. And I think it was really only in special circumstances, like you mentioned, in the aftermath of the plague, where there had been a great culling, or maybe people discovered came to a new island or a resource where there were no humans yet. Like for a period of time, they could enjoy plenty. And then since the Industrial Revolution, where economic growth has been so rapid that population growth, although it has been high, hasn't been able to keep up, that you have been able to sort of have increasing average incomes.
So we talked about AI right now and the current trends we're seeing, but now I want to move into the heart of your book, which is what you described as deep utopia, full technological maturity. And as a brief overview for our listeners, this is where AI far exceeds human capacities in almost all tasks, where we can simulate virtual experiences to be indistinguishable from the experiences we experience now, where the world is plastic, that anything materially that can be done within the realms of physics, that we have that technology to do, but also that we ourselves are plastic, right? So in this deep utopia, you described how, for obvious reasons, work other than the types of work you described, priest, prostitute, and politician, other than jobs that constitutively require humans, are already made redundant. But I think the most interesting claim here on redundancy is that leisure, or a lot of human leisure, would also be made redundant as well. Why is that?
If you go through those sort of leisure activities one by one, you can, for many, cross them out, or at least put a little question mark on top of them, whether they would still have a point in this condition of technological maturity. So maybe some billionaire goes to the gym, 5 times a week because they want to. Why? They want to be fit and healthy, and maybe they feel more relaxed afterwards. But if you had this drug that would induce exactly the same effects without you having to go there and sweat and make that, then you could still go to the gym, but why? Like if you could just pop the pill, you get exactly the same health effects, the same body, the same mental clarity after. Like I think many people would just pop the pill. We talked earlier about child rearing, like maybe people would still want to do that, but a lot of the specific activities involved in child, like changing the diapers, like doing this kind of, a lot of it is kind of individually things you might be tempted to outsource. And then you can go through leisure activity by leisure activity. And I think many of them would lose their original purpose at technological maturity, and then if you did them, it would have to be for some other reason. Generally speaking, I think you would have a kind of post-instrumental condition, where to a first approximation, there would be nothing you would need to do in order for something else to happen, because there would be a shortcut to the other thing. You could sort of press a button or like request your AI or robot to do that thing, and you wouldn't have to exert effort yourself to get that outcome. And so all the things we do for those instrumental reasons would drop out of the picture, maybe with some like class of exceptions. But
And so I think this is the most interesting insight in your book, which is even if we solve all of the tremendously difficult problems around alignment, around all the other issues that you described in your various other books, and we get to the maximally good state, right, where politics, society, and AI is purely working for us, it's still, in some sense, difficult to imagine what a good life looks like, because it's so different from how we conceive of a good life today. And so when so much of work and so much of leisure is made redundant, what is the best type of life one can live in such a utopia?
Well, it's actually quite challenging to really envisage a great, because you would risk undermining a lot of the things that currently give meaning to life, and you would feel almost at a loss. There's this kind of, do we just become these kind of amorphous, drugged out pleasure blobs, or what, and then it might seem quite alienating and unattractive. I think though that if you push through that, I think there is a there on the other side of something that actually would be very worthwhile.
So in your book, you described 5, let's call it moats of defense for a life in deep utopia. And I found this sort of way of framing it as already very interesting, because you think of, in utopia, you're not defending things, right? But you are defending here because of how difficult it's to imagine a good life here. Hedonic valence, experience texture, autotelic activity, artificial purpose, and social cultural entanglement. These will become, in your view, the pillar of the good life once you push through, as you describe it. So can you give us an overview of what each of these means?
The first one being hedonic quality. So this is basically the observation that we could have a lot of pleasure in utopia. Pleasure in the wide sense, not just kind of physical, but mental, like enjoyment. Like you could actually immensely enjoy every hour and every day of life to degrees that are like at least would match the sort of the peak current human experiences, perhaps go a lot beyond that. And it's easy to sort of dismiss this because it's like a philosophically boring point. I mean, it's kind of trivial that when you have this advanced neurotechnology, you could do this. And then we immediately jump to sort of thinking, well, that's a kind of degenerate existence. We think of junkies, and it's like not really but like actually, it I think is super important, maybe the most important, and this on its own might make it very worthwhile to swap out the current world for the. I mean, I should say there is also a sort of -1th mode, which the book doesn't talk very much about, but is super important, which is just to get rid of the negatives that currently plague the human condition, which is like immense and terrible. But here we are thinking about what could you do more than just kind of getting rid. And so there, just this hedonic well-being, like that every day could actually be an immense delight. Like there are some people who are like philosophical hedonists. They think pleasure is the only thing that matters and the absence of pain. So for them, that's kind of case closed at this point, right? But there are other value systems that maybe think pleasure is a good thing, but there are other good things. So let's see what we can add to just mere hedonic well-being. And so then the second one is experience texture. We observe that not just can these utopians have great level of enjoyment, but rather than just being sort of dazed out junkies that have a diffuse, confused sense of pleasure, they could like attach this pleasure to valuable experiences, like say the appreciation of beauty, or the understanding of deep, important truths. So like pleasure in like learning and understanding the basic laws of physics, learning about human nature, learning about, and appreciating great art and natural beauty, plays, and like that's how they get their fun. It's not just like the junkie, but it's like this kind of connoisseurship that is also exquisitely joyful. Maybe appreciating the moral virtue and goodness in various people and historical people and so forth. That already seems to like make it more attractive. And then you can add some further things, like so it's not the case that you need to imagine these utopians as mere passive recipients of these experiences of truth, beauty, and understanding of deep truths that they take enjoyment in. This would be this kind of autotelic stuff. So they don't just sit there passively like observing great beauty and feeling joy, but they could go around and like doing stuff. Artificial purpose is purpose that we create in order that we are then able to engage in purposeful activities. So you could set yourself some maybe arbitrary goal, and then once you have that goal, then if you select that goal in a suitable way, you could then have instrumental reasons to engage in various efforts to achieve it. So the key here is that the goal you set yourself has to be sort of constitutively such that it calls on you to make an effort rather than for you to press the button to have the robot do it. Right. So you can bake into the goal that the goal needs to be achieved by your own efforts. Otherwise, like so the goal is to achieve a certain thing with your own efforts. Then if you have that goal for whatever reason, then now you have purpose, because the only way you can achieve your goal is through your own efforts. So we can think of this like the paradigm case is kind of various forms of games where maybe you decide to play a game of golf. There was previously no reason why the ball would have to go into a sequence of holes. It's like a completely arbitrary goal, but you adopt that goal and now you have a reason to try hard to hit the ball in exactly certain ways to achieve this goal. And you could generalize that. You could have much more complex games with, multiplayer, multimodalities, like, extending maybe over years, and that could then give you purposeful activity, not just activity. And so those are the first four. And there is like one remaining one, which is there would be some natural purposes that could survive into technological maturity. But there would be sort of subtler purposes.
Like what natural purposes would survive in this post-instrumental state?
Well, take something like, so if you currently have some value or goal that, say, you value the continuation of a certain tradition. That might be something you just happen to, that many people would right now have that as one of their values. And the tradition might be such that it just isn't continuing unless humans are continuing to do it. It might be like constitutively part of the tradition that humans are doing this thing every year in a certain way, like imagine some ritual or something like that. So then those would survive because there would be, like you could create robots who would be doing this stuff, but it wouldn't count as or honoring your ancestors. Like it might not count as you honoring your ancestors. Your value of honoring your own ancestors might not be served by building a whole like ensemble of robots who are like going around and paying visits to their grave or thinking about them. Like it might require you to do it for that value to be achieved. More broadly, I think various forms of social entanglements where, we touched upon it a little bit earlier when we discussed parenting, where if there is this existing relationship between a child and a parent, and part of what is valuable about that is that it's these particular individuals who are relating in a certain way, then that could also give you a natural purpose, even at technological maturity, to continue to do certain things and interact in various ways with your child. And this might at first sight seem weak, like compared to a lot of the reasons we have things to do today. There are like very stark, tangible, immediate consequences if we fail to do them. So like maybe somebody has to go into work every morning because otherwise they will lose their job and then they can't pay their rent, and then they will get thrown out on the street, and then it will be cold. And this is like a very sort of hard set of consequences. And a lot of the stuff we do today are motivated by these kind of hard consequences. And in utopia, a lot of that would go away. But I think, like, just as you walk outside in the daytime, you see the sun. You don't see the stars. They're much fainter than the sun, but they're still there. I see these subtle values as already being there. Like, there's a whole host of these more almost aesthetic reasons for doing things that are blotted out from sight currently, because there are these kind of more screaming moral and practical needs that we need to take care of in our lives. But if you imagine a scenario where all of that went away, like the sun set, and then it would make sense for our evaluative pupils to dilate, to take in more of the fainter light that comes from these subtler values.
Right. So what I understand these 5 rings of defense is that the first 4 rings, a critic might say what's lacking from them is a kind of necessity, right? That I feel I need to do X, Y, Z because it's from this external source that gives my life purpose. And it seems like you're trying to rescue necessity in utopia by highlighting a subset of activities, like honoring one's ancestors, that it constitutively requires us humans, or maybe even stronger, you as an individual to do. And that's how you rescue necessity. And so maybe an analogy here is, LeBron playing in the NBA, bring back the championship to his hometown, Akron, Ohio. There's nothing necessary about that, right? It's a set of rules that we've invented for ourselves, but it doesn't make it any less meaningful for the people involved. Is that a good way to understand it?
Yeah, well, if he independently wants to do this, or if there is an independent value that this is something that should happen, that if it were a case that he just set himself this goal, because otherwise what should I do all day long, and then he convinced himself to pursue it, then it would be an instance of the 4th artificial purpose. Right. But if there's some independent reason that was not just created in order that somebody has something to do, then it would count as a natural purpose.
Right. And in this example of LeBron winning the championship for Cleveland, it would be something like the recognition and expectation of his family and friends and the whole city that he grew up in. Would that be a good example of something that would make this social cultural entanglement instead of artificial purpose?
Yeah, so that would give him a real reason to do this if people continue to want that to happen, and if he cares about what other people want or what they will think of him.
So it seems like social cultural entanglement relies heavily on the economy of recognition, right? What people desire, what people give honor to, and what people give esteem to. Do you think that humans will start esteeming the recognition of non-human agents? And maybe we're already starting to see the genesis of this, where there are these dating bots that have already existed. And right now, it's only appealing to people who are struggling to form real human relationships. But I remember there was one dating bot that after they changed the algorithm and the dating bot behaved nothing like what they previously behaved like, the people were in tears, as if a real family member had died. So it seems like if eventually we think that we'd care as much about artificial recognition as human recognition, then a lot of these social cultural entanglements would be threatened. Because presumably we can tell with a robot what to recognize or what to give esteem to.
Yeah, that's right. So you could have these future social entanglements with various forms of digital minds, but you have a kind of legacy. So if now you care about certain people, you might not want, even if you had some brain technology that could sort of extirpate that care and implant a different care, or so you maybe somebody who's kind of fate of falling in love with the wrong person, but it might have been better if they had fallen in love with somebody else, but once they are there, they are there. And so we might have these legacy purposes that come from current commitments that we care about and that we will carry on to into technological maturity. I think it's not the only. I mean, so there certainly are these social entanglements. I think there might also be more broadly aesthetic reasons. Like you might think it would just be a more beautiful way to live your life if you did certain things yourself and upheld various things and kept doing certain things. Even maybe avail yourself of a lot of the conveniences, but it would just be. So I think those could, and spiritual and religious reasons for doing things also could plausibly survive.
Right, I see. And so I want to go back to the beginning about pleasure, because I think I want to defend your position a bit, because there are entire schools of very serious philosophies, for example, the Epicureans, who do see that pleasure as the supreme good. And so that literally might be enough. But even for someone who we naturally consider to think of pleasure as this kind of secondary or tertiary thing, someone like Aristotle, when you read him closely, what the virtuous man is someone who takes pleasure in doing the right thing, right? So it's about correctly aligning one's pleasure. So I think that adds credence to your view that pleasure itself might be worth jumping into the state, if nothing else.
Yeah, I mean, in the second case, I guess particularly if the pleasure was kind of coupled with if you took pleasure in the right things, which is like, yeah, that could be like taking pleasure in contemplating the right things or in engaging in the right kinds of activities and so forth. So yeah, you can. I think in general, it's nice if we steer towards a future that will score high on a wide range of different values and according to many different people's preferences. If we can do that by just compromising slightly on any one of the values. So I think because the future could be very big in terms of the resources available, there would be a bunch of different values that it could be quite cheap to satisfy. And so we should make sure to satisfy all of those values. There are certain values that are resource hungry. Like if you're a utilitarian, for example, like you can always make more happy people. And so you just want more and more and more resources. But if there are other values that just needs a little bit and then they are sort of almost maxed out, then it seems like let's do that. And then, the outer space, maybe the utilitarians could have a bigger say about how we dispose of that.
What about values that could compete with each other? And I think this factors into this pleasure case, because in Christian theology, for example, a lot of the sins aren't loving the wrong things, but they're liking the right things, but in the wrong degree, right? So lust, gluttony are all about liking good things, but to such an immense degree that you ignore some of the more important things in life. So here's a concern, Professor Boström. You might be able to design a perfect superdrug that's like Molly plus mushrooms plus cocaine, all the pleasures of all the drugs we have right now, with zero of the side effects continuously. And there might be nothing objectionable about that in itself, except for the fact that such an immense pleasure would detract us from pursuing perhaps some of the less obviously good and interesting parts of our lives, but are no less important for a flourishing life in the long run.
Yeah. So I think that certainly would be the case today. With more mature technology, you might imagine having the ability to create more fine-grained experiences that, you could remove sort of the addictive potential and the sort of stupefying effect of some intoxicants, the adverse, implications for your liver and blood pressure, like all of these things. But also like psychologically, rather than just having it a kind of monotone, dumb pleasure, and that's the alternative to living a rich and engaged life in deep relationships with other people, you could weave these things together in a more intricate way, so that the pleasure comes from these virtuous and appropriate activities and thoughts and experiences.
Right. So to give an example that certainly will be outdated, it's like ingesting a drug or undergoing biotechnical enhancements that gives me immense pleasure when I brush my teeth, when I visit my friends, when I go to bed in the right time. Right. It's about exactly like what Aristotle described, like interweaving pleasure into what also would in itself make for a good life.
Yeah, that seems right. Like, so some of the specifics there might need to be like, you might not need to brush your teeth anymore.
Right,
in
exactly.
this
That's why I said it
condition,
would be outdated, right?
But yeah, so it would be focused more perhaps on what is intrinsically valuable activities and experiences, as opposed to these kind of instrumental necessities. So right now, there are all these things we have to do in our lives. And so, yeah, let's take pleasure in them because then we do them more and it's like all works, right? But even in a condition where you didn't have to do all of these things, like you don't have to, clean your house because you have a robot that cleans it. Your teeth are like enhanced so they don't rot even if you don't brush them, etc., etc. Then in that scenario, it seems like what we should be spending more of our time on are activities that are intrinsically valuable.
Right.
And so then taking pleasure in those would seem to be appropriate.
Yeah. And that might be even better for someone concerned with virtue, because we would be able to program the virtuous activities as more pleasurable, right? So, for example, to respond to the Christian critic that I just brought up, we might say, yes, we are going to make sexual activity 10 times more pleasurable, but we can also dial up reading the Bible or the contemplation of God to be even more pleasurable, so that pleasure naturally directs us to a good life in and of itself.
Yeah, or the sexual pleasure, like being specifically connected to the in wedlock case, etc., etc. I mean, we have already a little. If it's like the Ozempic, for example, I think is kind of reduces people's vice of overeating too much, and so there are like these limited ways. Now, there might be sort of harder trade-offs. So there might be certain values that, for example, maybe it would be perhaps appropriate for these utopians occasionally to remember the earlier times and the horrors and tragedies of history, and maybe feeling sad and mournful when they kind of contemplate that. Maybe they would have, like, I don't know, like imagine an annual ceremony where you try to think of all the people who died before they ever got to experience this, and with some beautiful ceremony to honor the
Right.
And then maybe you don't want to have like, I mean, certainly certain forms of pleasure would seem to be inappropriate, and maybe you would need to actually have sadness or maybe some kind of bittersweet. I don't know. There's a huge design space here that hopefully they could sort of work out.
I see. One thing that seems to be threatened, even with these 5 modes of defense, is interestingness, right? Not living a boring life. Because the challenge is you could be amortal. You could potentially live forever until something catastrophic happens to you. Is there any defense for a boring life, given of how long we'll live?
First of all, there's an even more basic distinction here between subjective boredom and objective boringness. So the subjective boredom is just you feel bored. That certainly could be abolished in a solved world, like through the same kind of neurotechnology that we have already discussed. And we have to be careful that that doesn't sort of infect our intuitions about the objective boringness or interestingness. Constantly remind that's already a big chunk of what we normally associate with things that are boring or interesting. All these people in utopia could like be totally fascinated all the time and just be completely immersed and find this like every fiber of their being is just like, wow, this is so cool and interesting and I want to dive in, right? So that's already there. Like, but if we're talking about this objective, so the objective notion of interestingness is a little bit harder to pin down. But it's some notion that certain experiences or activities are sort of maybe such that it would be fitting to be interested in them, and others it would be sort of so like just staring at the wall, maybe you think that even if you could take a drug that would make that feel super interesting, that there is like some sort of normative disvalue in that because it's not the kind of object that it would be appropriate to be super. So then you can think objective interestingness. Well, so to the extent that it involves something like complexity and richness and sophistication of your experiences or activities, they could sort of just rack that up to 11. There is a slightly different version of interestingness, objective interestingness, where it calls for fundamental novelty, where you might run out of that. That it's like, so for example, if you think it's not nearly as interesting to learn about fundamental physics as it is to discover it for the first time, then eventually we will have figured out what all the basic laws of nature are and the fundamental truth and the big general concepts, and then scientists will have to content themselves with finding smaller and smaller truths, more local truths that are less profound, and so that's a kind of form of interestingness that you would eventually run out of, or maybe you would set aside little pockets of ignorance and mysteries to sort of, as I alluded to earlier. If you think about human lives currently, if you take this second notion of sort of fundamental novelty in an individual person's life, I think a lot of that happens really early on. And so like in the first couple of years of life, think about, so you discover, you discover that there is a world, like that's a pretty fundamental discovery, right? And then like it contains objects like that continue to exist even when you look away. Like, wow, that's like just like a jaw-dropping real like cognitive revolution, right? And then you discover that there are other people in the world. Like now, like when you're grown up, what's like the most profound thing you learn in a given year? Like it's registered a lot lower on the sort of Richter scale of fundamental novelty. And so we are already suffering huge diminishing returns within our current lifespan. If you sort of look at the human, like the planet Earth, as it were, from some alien comes here, and like the average person's life, like how much fundamental novelty is there? Like they are all, maybe a few people are doing some interesting new things, but most people are just doing the same. They have the same old thoughts, the same old fears, and the same hopes, and they hope, boy meets girls, yada, 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 get a job, get a paycheck, get old, somebody passes away, you're sad for a while, and then you eat, and that's like, so from a certain lens, you might think that our current lives would be extremely boring already, just because it's already pretty much been done, and only small details are different.
In fact, I want to generalize this. This might be a caricature of your view, but this was my kind of takeaway of how you essentially are defending life in utopia, which is you're saying, look, you think you want this fundamental novelty, you think you want deep purpose, this kind of world historic sense of meaning. Look at your life now. How many of us have those things, and yet so many of us live great lives. What you actually want is a lot of pleasure, social engagements, aesthetic experiences. It's kind of like, your argument is kind of like the sophist position in the gorgeous. Like, let's stop talking about these highfalutin values with big fancy names like purpose, meaning, and interestingness, and let's get the basics done. And the example you gave was Nietzsche. And you said something like, Nietzsche talks a big game about his higher men and the Napoleons of the world. He lived like a bohemian, reading and writing books in the Alps. Is that a fair categorization of your view?
Well, I think Nietzsche was one of those people who would have a relatively more plausible claim to interestingness in this later sense, like in that he thought big original thoughts and really dove into that. I think that there is, if you have an axiology, a theory of value that is kind of pluralistic, I think given that, it's pretty plausible that there is some extra value in also having this third kind of interestingness that's kind of globally registers in a significant way. I'd say that even there, though, like if you just zoom out a little bit further, it's probably an infinite universe out there, and with a lot of other planets, with a lot of other civilizations that have already thought the same thoughts and thought much better thoughts and created better. So depending on your scale, we might already be completely unable to realize any fundamental novelty in the world. But if you do focus on this mesoscopic scale, that is kind of either an individual life or like the globe as it is now with 8 billion humans or so, and you think that that's where I want to make the significant difference on that scale, there's a particular kind of, then I'd say that right now is the golden era of purpose. Right now there are immense stakes in the world. There are a lot of immediate moral urgent causes where you could individually make a significant difference. Plus, we are seemingly approaching this critical juncture in human history upon which the next 1 billion years might depend. Like this, if you want real purpose, like knock yourself out now, like because it's never gonna be like more at stake than it is right now and in the next few years. And if you can't even bother to do this right now, like then, I mean, how much value do you really place on this kind of global purpose?
Right. And so is my reading of your view of human nature right, which is you're defending the life in deep utopia, not by rescuing this deep global sense of purpose, meaning, interestingness, but by suggesting people actually don't need that or desire it?
Yeah, I think it's like one value of which we might have less in a solved world. But I think we could have a lot more of most of the other values, such that the net balance is like an enormous positive.
I see.
I mean, like, yeah, okay, so maybe if there weren't people starving, you would be deprived of the purpose of feeding them, etc. But still, it's a trade I would be happy to take.
Right.
And there's like something lost there. Like there's like something nice and glorious in somebody going out of their way and feeding the starving. That's like a little plus there. But there's also this huge negative. And if we could all just have enough to eat without that, I think that would be better. And you can, I think, generalize that.
Right. When you looked back at history in the book, you said that the periods and the people worth dramatizing or talking about are rarely the good periods or good lives that you would want to live.
Yeah, there's like a big difference, and this is like a fundamental thing to bear in mind when forming some opinion about this kind of utopian problem. That you could evaluate a hypothesized condition from two different perspectives, and what we, I think, often default to if we're not careful is the external point of evaluation. Like we look at this like future utopian condition as if it were like a stage play. We sit in the audience and we look at, is this, and then we form some like kind of thumbs up or thumbs down. But from that perspective, I think we will tend to overvalue interestingness and drama. Like if you go to the theater, you want stuff, you know, to happen. You want like, you know, there's like a king and he gets killed and then the assassin flees and then they overtake him and there's like, or the movies we write or the novels, etc. So good stories often have a lot of suffering in them. But there is a different, and which I think is the right way to evaluate this, is not like how good is utopia from the outside to look at, but how good is it actually from the inside to inhabit, to live it. And there, I think, yeah, the stories that, you know, are most interesting to read about are not necessarily the stories that are best to live out in your own life. And we need to correct for that if we're actually trying to build a utopia that we would be moving into. If it's not just a fiction or a screenplay, but like an actual plan for what we want to spend the rest of our time in.
So you mentioned something like there are no wars in history that are worth it, no matter what kind of great art is produced by them. But I wonder if, on the off chance that that war or conflict or bad thing creates these civilizational grounding pieces of art, would you still will that away? So here's the thought experiment. You know, ex ante, I think you would say no Trojan War, right? But ex post, given we know how fundamental the Trojan War was to establishing not only just Greek tragedy, but Greek philosophy and Greek culture, would you, if you could wave your wand one way or the other, would you say, spare those lives in the Trojan War, I don't want my Iliad and Odyssey, or even the responses to that?
I don't feel entirely competent to make these judgments. I would think that at some point enough is enough. I mean, we've had a lot of wars by now, and we've had a lot of people dying for various causes and suffering horrible fates, and you know, maybe there's a certain kinds of value that can exist in human style life, and but if you think about this, do we want, like, okay, so maybe you want another few decades, another few hundred years, another few thousand years, but like 100,000, we need 1,000,000 years more of these like two-legged creatures running around here and killing one another and getting cancer and like having headaches and stuff. Like at some point, I think we want to maybe unlock the next level and say, well, you know, if there are values in some of these tragic and beautiful things, like it might not scale with the number of instances of the tragic and beautiful. Like having 10 tragedies doesn't create 10 times as much beauty value as one. And so it's the kind of value that seems to saturate.
Right.
Whereas like the value of like a nice cup of tea, the 1,000th cup of tea might be, just as taste just as good as the first cup of tea. So eventually, you've kind of ticked all this. You've had your big life. You're the youth of humanity. You've had your adventures and stuff, and then you settle down a little bit.
I like that analogy.
I think there might be different kinds of adventures that might be a lot more interesting in many ways. It's just that maybe they involve less suffering in this scenario.
So other than this global sense of purpose, meaning, global sense of stakes, global sense of novelty and interestingness, is there any fundamental set of human values that will not be fulfilled in this utopia or be fulfilled worse than currently?
I think a lot of them have some connection with this, this sense, the purpose and meaning that they seem to be particularly threatened by the affordances of a solved world. Depending on your kind of more spiritual and religious views, there could be, I guess, additional constraints there in terms of what could be achieved in a solved world. And then this kind of fundamental interestingness of the form that requires novelty on a global scale, not a cosmic scale, not on a sort of day-to-day scale, but on the sort of scale of planet Earth. That also might just be so many times you can discover, like, you can discover relativity theory once, the theory of evolution once, and then there might be 50 more discoveries of that magnitude that you can make, and then after that it starts to dwindle.
Right.
So that would be another example.
And I think that's a very interesting insight on human nature, which is that humans are the type of creatures such that one of our core values requires us to be in a fallen world or in an imperfect world, right? Meaning this kind of global sense of scale, purpose, or novelty.
Our natures have maybe been conditioned on the existence of problems in that throughout human history and prehistory, and indeed all the way back to our great ape ancestors and way earlier than that, there were like various forms of scarcity and things that needed to be done all day long. You had to check for predators, you had to get food, you had to find, and so like a lot of our psychology is kind of just assumes that there are these needs. And we see a little bit of how problems can arise when that is no longer the case today with obesity, right? So we have kind of psychologically evolved in a way that assumes that food is scarce and you need to try to find it and grab it when you can and stuff yourself as much as possible because maybe tomorrow there won't be anything to eat. And we've removed that constraint from our external world in at least in wealthier countries. There's plenty, like the fridge, is full of food. And now there's this mismatch between our environment and our psychology. As we move to technological maturity, that little crack could open up much wider, and there could be a huge mismatch between what our sort of evolved psychological nature is and what the environment actually demands of us. And that's kind of what creates this problem in the first place, that we would need to possibly change ourselves quite fundamentally to become suited for life in utopia.
Right. So here's a proposal about rescuing the sense of at least perceived global purpose, global novelty, global meaning, global stakes, which is to wipe off our memories and then go into a VR simulation that is indistinguishable. Now, obviously, the philosopher's objection is laid out in the experience machine, right? Where the conclusion is that you wouldn't want to enter into such a machine, even if you couldn't tell, because it would be unfitting, that there's something objectively bad about it, even if the experiencer doesn't know. But correct me if I'm wrong, I believe there were subsequent variations on this experience machine thought experiment that said, but what if I told you that you live in an experience machine now? Would you want to pull out? And I believe the intuition is that you wouldn't want to pull out. And so what people are really after isn't fittingness to objective reality, but it's a kind of familiarity. So if that's the case, what's wrong with wiping out our memories and pretending to live like Achilles in Utopia for one life and just keep on doing this to get that kind of global sense of meaning back?
First, it's not clear how much meaning you would get from that. So if there was no, it would kind of fall, it seems to me, into the artificial purpose category.
But you wouldn't know, right? That's the key part.
No, you wouldn't know, but
right.
that's also the case in Utopia. That, I mean, if you want some like partial amnesia so that you forget about various things, that would be easily arranged. I think, like, I mean, I presume that you might want to edit the, like, so if edit the sort of version 2. Like, if you want to revisit history, like, there are a lot of parts of it that I think you would want to omit from your sort of recapitulation of it, either because they are too horrible or because they are just kind of a bit dull. But certainly you could imagine creating virtual worlds that you could interact with and inhabit and explore in different configurations and with different variations.
So I just want to draw a distinction here, because when I heard you say artificial purpose, I thought what you meant was, for example, going rock climbing. So I could get helicoptered up to the cliff face, but I knowingly restrained my own set of available means to climb this rock face, knowingly, hence making it artificial. But if I wiped my memory and entered into the life of Achilles, like phenomenologically, I wouldn't be able to know, right? And so it would lose the artificial side of that, at least from the subject, no?
Yeah, so I think there is a continuum there. If you you could imagine the rock climber, once they're halfway up the wall, today, that might not be a helicopter that could reach them in time. They didn't have to climb the wall. That was kind of artificial purpose. But once they are there, they really have no choice other than to like do their utmost to keep doing it. Otherwise, on pain of death, right? And similarly, you could imagine utopians, if they wanted to, could create little holes in utopia, right, where the world is not solved, where there's like real need and constraint and stakes of various kinds. If you thought that was a added value to sort of being subject to these forms of risk. Now, you don't want to make too many holes, or you just kind of destroy the utopia, right? Like if you could like just destroy the whole utopia, you're back to scarcity and real need again. But that would also mean giving up all the good things about it. But you might have little pockets like designed, and maybe there would be real stakes, but maybe the stakes wouldn't be quite like a child dies from brain cancer type of stakes, but more like, well, if you fail at this task, you will have a month of being excluded from your normal fun gadgets and friends, and you have to like work hard for a month to sort of get back to where you were. Something more kind of human scale stakes.
Right. I think the interesting question about human nature, of whether we think that the picture you painted in Deep Utopia is an attractive one or not, has to do with how important necessity is for a good life, right? And for someone on the opposite extreme, someone like the Unabomber, he thought that today, even in our current technological society, there are not enough necessary primary actions that we have to do. And so even now, he wants to take us away from the current technological utopia that we are in. And so I found that to be a very interesting extreme opposite end of this experiment.
Yeah, although I think some of what he was thinking about were the sort of contingent psychological effects of living the current lives, where there are various forms of psychological from overeating, but also like various kinds of malaise that can happen when people live in this modern artificial, like you get addicted to your social media feed, and if you never can you really connect to any other, can you have real friends if you've never been in a life or death situation where you like saw that they like were a true friend, even though they risked their life? Like that might be a form of connect. There might be all sort of ways in which the mismatch between what we evolved to do and the current world creates psychological ailments. Now, maybe they are outweighed by the comforts and benefits. I think that's plausibly the case, but still there is this kind of psychological cost. Probably some kinds of mental illnesses are more widespread because we're not perfectly adjusted to the modern, but those things could be fixed. Like you wouldn't have to overeat or feel socially alienated or in other ways. Like you might even get closer to nature in some ways, like rather than living in sort of concrete square buildings, like you could imagine at technological maturity, you would be actually living in some sort of savanna, like, but minus the bugs perhaps, and the temperature would always be right, and
right.
And so in many ways you could have first you could adjust the psychological apparatus so that it didn't have these negative symptoms. Second, to some extent, you could also adjust the environment so that it would in many ways more match what we were naturally designed to interact with.
What was striking to me was how theological our entire conversation today has been, and how similar the thought experiment you set up was to the Christian afterlife. So let me just give you a few examples. So in your deep utopia, right, plasticity means that the material world is not really the concern. But we also have our individual bodies, right? In the Christian afterlife, individuality is preserved. So all kind of social, political issues are resolved. And just as the saints in heaven are supposedly spend their time contemplating God, a lot of the activities that you described are contemplation-based. And also, you delivered this book in a lecture format where you kind of construct this world in 6 days, 6 days of lectures, and then you rest on the 7th. What do you make of the theological aesthetic of your work?
Yeah, I mean, the number of days is more, I thought it was kind of done it took kind of 6 years to do the 6 days. I felt like it was time for a wrap at that point. But I think in general that there are strong parallels between the thoughts developed in religious and theological context because it's like in some sense the same fundamental question, like what's the best possible future for a human being if you abstract away from various contingent limitations and constraints. More generally, I think actually when you think through the full and ultimate implications of the sort of standard physicalist worldview and really think in many ways you get to considerations traditionally developed in a theological context. I mean, we alluded to the simulation argument earlier, right? There it's very striking. It starts from a different kind of assumption to begin with, but the end result is something at least structurally, strikingly similar to many religious and theological conception. My most recent paper, AI Creation and the Cosmic Host, is another example of how you start to think through about, in this case, various ethical questions related to how we should relate to digital minds and AIs that we are building and the possibilities of levels of, where again, you sort of come up. And so it might be that there's like, the philosopher Derek Parfit, who was a colleague at Oxford, he had this metaphor in his work of a big mountain, and he did work on metaethics, and he had this view that different approaches to metaethics, sort of consequentialism and deontology, they were kind of climbing the same mountain from different sides, and that when you thought through each one to its kind of purest and clearest form, that they would sort of converge at the peak. And I think maybe there is like some similar phenomenon where you have a big mountain where people have been climbing it from the theological side, and if you climb it far enough, high enough from the naturalistic side, maybe you get to a similar conclusion in the end.
Thank you so much for a fascinating discussion.
Thank you, Jonathan. I enjoyed this.